The call came on a Tuesday morning, and by the time it ended, I was already in my car. I didn't know that yet, that everything was about to split into before and after. I just knew Leonard's voice was wrong. Not broken, not panicked. Controlled in the specific way a person gets controlled when they are holding something down by force. The way you speak when the words you actually want to say are too dangerous to let out in the open. He said my name twice in one sentence. That was the first thing that told me. My name is Lydia Hale. I am 63 years old, and I raised one child, my son, Everett, on my own in Birmingham, Alabama, with careful hands and a stubborn heart. Everett built himself into a millionaire before he was 40. I watched him do it. I was there for every year of it. I had not spoken to him in 4 months. I told myself he was traveling. Successful men travel. They disappear into schedules and time zones and back-to-back meetings that leave no room for weekly calls from their mothers. I called once a week anyway and left voicemails that got shorter as the months passed because I was running out of ways to say I'm here without saying I'm scared. I kept his contact photo as my phone's lock screen, so his face was the first thing I saw every morning. A small thing. The kind of small thing you do when the larger thing is too much to look at directly. I never filed a missing persons report. Everett is a grown man with a wife, a business partner, assistants, a calendar managed by people paid to manage it. The police would have told me what I was already telling myself. I nearly convinced myself it was working. If you're here with me this far, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read more of those comments than people probably realize. Then Leonard called. Lydia. Pause. Lydia, I need you to come to my office, right now. His voice was flat in a way that had nothing to do with calm. Don't say a word to Nadell. Don't say anything to Sherman. Come first. I asked why. He said, come first. I'll tell you why when you're here. I was in my car before the call ended. I have been to Leonard's office many times, for signings, for celebrations, for the kind of milestone moments Everett always made sure I was present for. I knew the room. I knew the light that came through the east window in the morning and the leather chair beside the bookcase and the framed photograph of Everett and Leonard at the company's first anniversary dinner. The room felt different now. Leonard closed the door behind me. He did not sit. He did not offer me water or tell me to make myself comfortable. He turned his laptop toward me and pressed play. Everett was on the screen. Alive. Thin in a way my brain kept trying to correct. The way your mind refuses the image your eyes are delivering because it cannot reconcile the man it knows with the man it is seeing. Concrete walls. No windows. A single bulb overhead. He was speaking directly into the camera with a stillness that was not peace. It was precision. Every word chosen. Every pause deliberate. He said he was being held. He said he didn't know exactly where. Then he said, Mom, don't go to the police yet. Not until you know more. You'll understand why. He said Sherman's name twice, not as an accusation, as a direction. I did not cry. I watched the video reach its end. Then I looked at Leonard and told him to play it again, because something about Everett's left hand had caught at the edge of my attention. Not a gesture exactly. Just a feeling of familiarity I couldn't place yet. Leonard replayed it. This time, I watched the hand almost the entire recording, and somewhere deep in the back of my mind, something old began trying to surface. Everett's left hand was open, palm facing the camera, fingers relaxed, held at his side in a way that was too still to be accidental. I watched it 3 seconds into the second viewing and felt something shift behind my sternum. Not understanding, not yet, but the beginning of it. The kind of recognition that arrives before the mind catches up to what the body already knows. I filed it away without speaking. Leonard was watching me watch the screen. He leaned forward slightly. "What are you seeing?" "Play it to the end first," I said. He did. When it finished, I sat back and looked again at the frozen image on the screen. Whatever Everett meant by that hand placement, neither of us fully understood it yet. But we both understood this much. A man being held in a concrete room who still thinks carefully enough to communicate something deliberate is a man who has not given up. Still thinking. Still calculating. Still fighting in the only way the situation allows. Leonard replayed the clip a third time, and this time, something old moved through the back of my memory so quickly I almost missed it. Not a full memory, just a feeling. Summer sunlight. Everett as a little boy. His hand lifted toward me from across a crowded place I could not fully see anymore. Gone again before I could catch it properly. I didn't tell Leonard that part. Weeks later, after Everett came home and was finally strong enough to sit through longer conversations without exhausting himself, I asked him directly about the hand. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. Then he said, "An open palm facing outward was something the two of us used when he was little. A quiet signal that meant I'm okay, but I can't say so out loud." He told me he wasn't even certain I would remember it. 30 years had passed, but by the time he recorded that video, he was running out of ways to communicate anything safely. So he tried anyway. And somewhere beneath all the fear and shock sitting inside me that morning in Leonard's office, my body had remembered before my mind did. That steadied me more than anything else in the room. Leonard finally closed the laptop. Then he told me what he had found 8 weeks earlier and had been carrying alone ever since. He and Everett built their business on a shared operating structure. Account flows Everett never fully separated as the company scaled. Leonard had visibility into certain financial movements an outside accountant would never naturally see. 8 weeks ago, he noticed transfers, irregular amounts, inconsistent timing, money moving quietly out of Everett's personal holdings into a holding company he did not recognize. He traced it carefully without triggering alerts or access notifications. The holding company eventually led back to Sherman Spence through 2 layers of LLC structure. I heard that and did not move. I sat with it the way you sit with something that rearranges not only the present, but the past. Every dinner, every handshake, every time Sherman sat across from me asking about my health while already carrying whatever he had become. Then I asked the question that had been sitting at the edge of my mind since the video ended. Why hasn't this been in the news? A man like Everett doesn't just disappear. Leonard's jaw tightened. He said Sherman moved early. Before Everett vanished publicly, he arrived at the company with a prepared explanation. Extended personal leave, private family matters, a request for discretion out of respect for Everett's wishes. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that naturally triggered panic. Leonard had no proof to contradict him at the time. And the story held because Everett's calendar had already been cleared in advance. That landed harder than everything else. Clearing a man's calendar requires access, trust, familiarity. Somebody who understood Everett's routines closely enough to know exactly how long his absence could remain invisible before people began asking the wrong questions. This wasn't impulsive. It was patient, built slowly by somebody standing close enough to touch his life without raising alarm. I thanked Leonard quietly and told him not to move on anything yet. Then I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table for nearly an hour without turning on a light, thinking about everything I had just learned and what it meant about everything I thought I already knew. By the time I finally stood up, I knew exactly what I had to do next. It required sitting across from my daughter-in-law and looking her directly in the eye without letting her see a single thing I was carrying. Nadell said yes before I finished the sentence. That was the first thing I noted. Not her voice, not her tone, the speed. A woman carrying nothing to hide takes a breath before she answers. Nadell didn't take a breath. She said yes, the way someone says yes when they have been waiting for a reason to not be alone with whatever they are carrying. I noted it, and I said nothing about it. We met at her house, Everett's house, on a Wednesday afternoon. She had made tea I didn't ask for and set out a plate of things neither of us touched. The house was clean in the particular way houses get clean when the person inside them has too much time and nowhere to put their hands. I recognized it. I had been doing the same thing in my own home for months. Nadell looked tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. Her grief was real. I want to be clear about that. I have known this woman for years, and I know what her face does when she is performing and what it does when she is not. What I was looking at across that table was not performance. The grief was genuine, but it was not clean. There was something running underneath it. Something older and more specific than missing a husband. It surfaced in small ways that a stranger would have missed entirely. A pause that lasted a half-second too long when I mentioned the last time I'd spoken to Everett. A deflection so smooth it almost didn't register, almost, when I asked whether she'd heard anything from his assistant recently. A moment when her eyes moved to the window and came back too quickly, like she'd caught herself going somewhere she wasn't supposed to go in front of me. I kept my face open and my voice gentle. I gave her nothing to read. What I was reading was this. Nadell was frightened. Not of me. Of something I couldn't see from where I was sitting. Something that had been in the room with her long before I arrived and would still be there after I left. The fear was practiced. Worn into her the way fear gets worn into a person who has been living alongside it for a long time. A woman who designed her husband's disappearance does not sit across a table from his mother looking like she is bracing for a ceiling to fall. I stayed 2 hours. I hugged her at the door. I told her to call me any time, day or night, and I meant it in ways she didn't fully understand yet. I waited until I was 3 streets away before I called Leonard. I told him 2 things. Nadell knows something about what happened to Everett, and Nadell did not plan it. Those 2 facts sit together in a way that raises questions I don't have answers to yet, and the answers matter before we take another step. Leonard was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what I wanted to do next. I told him I needed someone who could move without being seen. Someone who could get close to Sherman Spence's daily life without Sherman ever knowing a question was being asked. No paper trail. No connection back to me. Someone who does this kind of work the way it needs to be done. Quietly, carefully, and without mistakes. There was a pause on Leonard's end. Then he said, I already know who to call. Leonard did not send me a resume or a background packet. He gave me a name and 1 sentence. Cormac Giles, 15 years. I trust him with things I've never spoken about publicly. That was enough. People who perform competence usually explain themselves at length. The truly capable ones rarely do. They let other people speak for them briefly and carefully, the way Leonard just had. Cormac contacted me 2 days later through a number that disappeared after the call ended. No company name, no office address, no paperwork connecting him to me directly. Leonard handled the financial side separately through channels I deliberately did not ask about. The less visible structure around Cormac, the better. What mattered was whether he could move quietly around Sherman Spence without being noticed. Initially, the answer appeared to be no. Cormac spent the first 4 days getting almost nothing useful. Sherman changed routes constantly during business hours, used underground parking structures whenever possible, took calls inside moving vehicles. left his office through secondary exits more often than the front. Twice, Cormac lost him entirely in downtown traffic after Sherman doubled back through commercial districts in patterns that looked random until you realized they repeated just enough to be intentional. That interested me. Men with nothing to hide do not practice disappearing. Cormac lost nearly an entire day after following the wrong rural route outside Birmingham because Sherman suddenly exited the interstate earlier than usual and never reappeared on the expected road network. Another afternoon became useless after heavy rain wiped visibility low enough that Cormac backed off, rather than risk pushing too close for confirmation. He did not dramatize any of this when he later explained it to me. He simply treated failed observation the way disciplined people treat weather, part of the work. On the fifth day, he noticed the first useful inconsistency. Sherman was unpredictable professionally. Personally, he was rigid. Same ATM twice a week within blocks of his home. Always cash withdrawals. Never large enough individually to trigger reporting concerns, but consistent enough across time to create rhythm. Same dry cleaner. Same fuel station. Same departure windows on certain evenings. And every 3 or 4 days, Sherman drove outside Birmingham alone. 40 minutes, almost, exactly. No assistant vehicle behind him, no business calls during the drive, no calendar entry connected to the timing. The first time Cormac followed him out there, Sherman unexpectedly pulled into a church parking lot near a split county road and sat inside the vehicle for 11 minutes without exiting. Testing surveillance. Cormac backed off immediately. That detail mattered to me more than the failed follow itself. A careless investigator pushes through moments like that and gets burned. A disciplined one understands when somebody is checking whether the road behind them feels too crowded. 2 days later, Cormac approached it differently. No direct tail. Leapfrog observation points instead. Rural gas station cameras. Public traffic feeds. Distance. That was how he finally found the property. Not dramatically, patiently. An aging structure sitting on isolated land 40 minutes outside Birmingham under ownership that initially led nowhere useful. No visible connection to Sherman. No obvious business purpose. Utilities, active but minimal. Property taxes paid through a management LLC that looked intentionally forgettable. Cormac still spent another 6 days verifying before reporting anything to me. That alone earned my trust. People desperate to impress you bring theories quickly. Careful people bring patterns only after those patterns survive pressure. The report itself was 7 pages. Photographs from legal distance, vehicle timestamps, ATM withdrawals tracked across multiple dates, maps documenting Sherman's repeated route toward the same isolated property. Notes about duration patterns. Sherman never remained longer than 90 minutes and never arrived with visible supplies large enough to explain renovation work or extended maintenance. One line stayed with me longer than the rest. He exits the property composed, not relaxed. Cormac explained the distinction beneath it. Relaxed people release tension naturally when they return to familiar environments. Sherman appeared instead like a man consciously resetting himself before re-entering ordinary life. I read that report twice at my kitchen table, then a third time slower. There was a property. That much now existed beyond instinct or suspicion. But properties are not crimes. A man visiting private land with cash in his pocket proves almost nothing legally. Holt would never move on that alone. And Leonard knew it. When I called him, he answered immediately. I told him Cormac had done good work. Then I asked the question sitting underneath everything else. What comes next? Leonard was quiet for a moment. Then he said something he had not mentioned before. I have one federal contact. Just that. No dramatic explanation. A man named Holt, 15 years. Never asked him for anything. I understood immediately what he meant. Holt was not a resource Leonard intended to spend lightly. "He won't move on suspicion," Leonard said. "If I bring him this now, he tells us to call local law enforcement or hire attorneys. We need something cleaner first." I agreed. Because there is a difference between believing your son is trapped somewhere and proving it in a way the law can touch. But after the call ended, I sat alone in my kitchen thinking about one detail, Cormac included, near the bottom of page 6. Sherman never once stayed overnight at the property. Not once. Whatever existed inside that building was not meant to support a life, only to contain one. What I am about to tell you, I did not know while it was happening. I learned it later, piece by piece, from Nadell herself in the weeks after everything came apart. I am telling it now because without it, nothing that follows makes complete sense. And this story only works if you understand exactly what kind of man Sherman Spence is. He is not a man who reacts. He is a man who observes, calculates, and moves, only when he believes the ground beneath him is shifting. Watching people was not a response to danger for Sherman. It was how he moved through life, even during calm seasons. Control, for him, was a permanent condition. So when something changed in Nadell, he noticed immediately. She had started asking questions, not about Everett's disappearance directly. She was smarter than that. What she asked about instead was structure, estate arrangements, account access procedures, the specifics of Everett's business agreements with Leonard, the kind of questions that sound harmless to ordinary people but sound very different to a man who understands exactly which information becomes useful once somebody starts quietly building leverage. Sherman did not confront her. Confrontation would have told her she'd been noticed, and a woman who knows she's being watched changes her behavior. Sherman needed her natural, predictable, still moving inside the boundaries he believed he controlled. So instead, he tested her. Small, false details, specific numbers, a carefully incorrect timeline involving one of Everett's accounts, information believable enough to repeat casually, false enough that Sherman would recognize it instantly if it surfaced somewhere it shouldn't. He was seeding a field. If that information ever returned to him through Leonard, through a financial question, through the wrong attorney or accountant, he would know exactly which direction Nadell had started moving in. He told himself it was precautionary. What he held over her was much older than Everett's disappearance. Nadell explained that part to me slowly after everything collapsed. Years earlier, early in her marriage, when she still believed her father wanted good things for her, Sherman involved her in paperwork she barely understood. Corporate filings, administrative signatures, routine approvals attached to business structures she had never been properly educated about. He always framed it the same way. Family business. Necessary formalities, simple signatures to keep operations moving smoothly. She signed because daughters raised by controlling men often mistake obedience for trust long before they realize the difference. Sherman kept every page. That paperwork became the fence around her life. If Nadell ever moved openly against him, he had enough signed material to place her inside transactions that could appear intentional to outside investigators. Maybe not enough to destroy her permanently, but enough to drag her into scrutiny beside him. Enough to make speaking dangerous. That was why she stayed quiet for years. Not because she lacked courage, because fear becomes practical after enough time. She had learned how to survive inside it carefully enough that most people never noticed it was there. The phone was the last thing Sherman did that week. Not some dramatic spy software installation out of a movie. Something quieter than that. He convinced Nadell her device security needed updating after several wealthy clients connected to the family business experienced account breaches. He told her he wanted a private security consultant to install additional protection software across immediate family devices. The kind of thing wealthy families actually do. She handed him the phone willingly. He kept it for 20 minutes one Sunday evening while she was downstairs making coffee. Later, Nadell would tell me she remembered him returning it with the exact same calm expression he used after discussing weather or dinner reservations. Nothing hurried. Nothing suspicious enough to alarm her immediately. Afterward, her phone occasionally ran warmer than usual. Battery drain increased slightly. Sometimes messages loaded slower. Small things. Not enough to scream danger. What Sherman installed did not give him magical access to every second of her life. It simply allowed monitoring of enough communication activity to alert him if certain patterns changed. Calls, searches, financial access attempts, contact behavior, precautionary. That was the word he used for almost everything dangerous he ever did. And because Nadell still believed fear was something she simply had to live around, she ignored the feeling growing quietly in the back of her mind. The walls were already up around her. She just had not found them yet. Cormac's second report arrived on a Thursday evening. 11 pages this time. I carried it to my kitchen table with a glass of water and read every word without stopping once. The property belonged to a man named Gerald Tate. No visible connection to Sherman Spence appeared in any normal search. No shared active businesses. No direct legal overlap. Nothing obvious enough to survive casual scrutiny. Cormac found the connection by going backward instead of forward, tracing dissolved entities, old licensing records, abandoned corporate filings most investigators would never bother opening. 11 years earlier, Sherman and Gerald Tate had both passed briefly through the same failed LLC tied to a third partner, now dead. Tiny connection, but real. Cormac followed it all the way to isolated land 40 minutes outside Birmingham. No neighboring houses within visible range. Long gravel access road. Aging structure surrounded by dense tree cover, thick enough to hide most activity, unless someone already knew exactly where to look. Cormac never crossed the property line. That mattered legally, and he understood it. He worked instead from public access points, utility pull-offs, roadside observation positions, wooded service easements. Over 8 days, he built the report slowly from patterns instead of intrusion. The first useful detail came from deliveries, not packages. Groceries. Every 4 or 5 days, Sherman stopped at the same small grocery store 20 minutes from the property before driving the remaining distance. The purchases followed strange repetition. Bottled water, canned soup, protein bars, over-the-counter pain medication, disposable razors, cleaning supplies. Enough for more than one person. But Sherman always arrived alone and always left alone. Cormac documented vehicle timing next. Lights appeared consistently in only 2 sections of the structure after dark. One upstairs, one downstairs near the rear side of the house. Most of the building remained unused. Then came the movement patterns. Cormac spent 3 mornings observing through long-range optics from a wooded service easement nearly 200 yards away. On 2 occasions, he observed a man exit briefly onto the rear section of the property under supervision. Not clearly enough for identification, but enough for description. Male, thin, unsteady posture, moved like someone whose muscles had forgotten regular movement. The second time it happened, Sherman remained close enough behind him that the distance never widened beyond a few feet. That detail changed everything. Not because it proved kidnapping legally, because it eliminated almost every ordinary explanation left. Cormac included photographs in the report, grainy from distance, but consistent enough to establish body structure and repeated movement patterns across separate days. Then came the audio. Not hidden microphones, nothing dramatic, just timing and patience. During Sherman's 3rd documented visit that week, voices carried briefly through an upstairs window, left partially open during heavy rain. Most of the conversation disappeared into weather and distance. The recording itself would never survive evidentiary review. But not everything vanished. Two male voices, one calm, one exhausted, and one fragmented line Cormac managed to isolate clearly enough to write down. "You said nobody was supposed to know." I stared at that sentence for a long time, because people being held voluntarily do not sound like that. The final section of the report was operational assessment. Short, precise. Cormac believed physical extraction was possible. The property layout was partially mapped, vehicle timing established, entry points identified. Sherman predictable enough operationally that a coordinated approach could likely reach the structure before he reacted. But then came the paragraph that mattered most. If they moved privately without simultaneous law enforcement involvement, Sherman would begin dismantling everything immediately. Financial records, ownership layers, communication trails. Every structure protecting Everett legally would disappear within hours. And if Everett survived the extraction itself, he would spend the remainder of his life trapped inside a case Sherman could muddy into endless ambiguity. Cormac wrote one sentence beneath that analysis. "A rescue without prosecutable structure becomes a relocation." I understood exactly what he meant. If Sherman walked free afterward, Everett would never truly be safe. I finished reading, sometime after 2 a.m. The kitchen clock above the stove read 2:14. I had not eaten since midday and felt none of it. I sat there, staring at those 11 pages, understanding something that hurt worse than not knowing ever had. We had likely found him, alive, close enough that a determined person could drive there before sunrise. And still, I could not go get my son, because love without patience would destroy him faster than the men already holding him. I sat in that kitchen until daylight started touching the windows. And for the first time since Leonard played me the video, I allowed myself to imagine something dangerous. Everett surviving long enough to come home. Then I imagined the other possibility immediately afterward, and I did not sleep at all. She found it on a Tuesday. She was not looking for it. Her phone had been running warm for 2 weeks, not hot enough to alarm her, just warm in the way a device runs warm when something in the background is working consistently and quietly. She assumed it was the battery. She took it to a repair shop 3 miles from the house, the kind of small, independent place she had used before for a cracked screen, because it was close, and she trusted the technician. He had it for 40 minutes. When he came back to the counter, he set it down between them and explained, in the careful tone of someone delivering news he isn't sure the person in front of him is ready for, that the battery was fine. What wasn't fine was a piece of software installed on the device that had no business being there. He showed her what it was, not in technical language, just plainly. Something that runs in the background, something that reports out, something someone put there intentionally. Nadell thanked him. She paid. She walked to her car and sat in it for a long time. I am telling this the way she eventually told it to me. Slowly, in pieces, with the particular difficulty of a person revisiting a moment that changed the shape of everything. She said the first thing she felt in that car was not anger. It was something closer to recognition, like a room she had always sensed but never been able to find the door to had finally opened. And what was inside it was exactly what she had always suspected but never been able to prove. Her father had been watching her. Not recently. The software had been installed weeks ago, which meant he had moved on her before she gave him any visible reason to. She did not remove it. That was the decision she made in that car. And I want you to understand how clear her thinking was in that moment, because it matters. Removing the device would tell him she had found it. And if he knew she had found it, she lost the only position she had, which was that he believed she was still fully inside the fence he had built around her life. A man who believes his surveillance is intact does not change his behavior. A man who discovers it has been compromised does. So she left it exactly where it was. She drove home. She made dinner. She moved through the rest of that evening the way a woman moves when she has no idea she is being watched, because that is precisely what she needed him to see. But something had shifted in her that the device could not detect, and her father could not monitor. The paperwork he held over her had kept her in place for years. The fear of what he could do with her signature on those documents had been enough, just enough, to hold her inside the silence he required. But finding that device did something the paperwork never had. It told her he was afraid. A man who is fully in control of a situation does not install monitoring software on his own daughter's phone. He does it because he is not certain, because something has made him uncertain. And uncertainty in Sherman Spence, she understood, was the closest thing to weakness she had ever seen in him. She started thinking about Everett every hour after that. Not abstractly, not the way grief thinks about someone, circling without landing. She thought about Markel specifically. She knew who he was. She knew what he did for her father. And she had watched him across 2 recent family dinners and 1 phone call she was not supposed to overhear. And what she had watched was a man coming apart at the seams, one careful thread at a time. She needed to reach Lydia. She could not use her phone. She was already seated when I walked in. That was how well she had planned it. Not arriving after me, arriving before, settled, with a drink in front of her, positioned so that our eyes would meet naturally the moment I came through the door. Anyone watching would have seen 2 women, surprised by the same small coincidence. A mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, both reaching for ordinary comfort in a difficult season, ending up at the same table by chance. There was nothing accidental about any of it. I had been coming to this particular coffee shop on weekday mornings for years. Everett knew that. He had sat across from me at that same corner table more times than I could count. Before early meetings, after church, on slow Saturdays that turned into long conversations. The small details of a life accumulate inside a marriage. Nadell had been paying attention to those details long before she needed them. I sat down across from her. I kept my face warm and my eyes soft, and I gave her nothing to read. She was not carrying her phone. I noticed that within the first 30 seconds, and I filed it without reacting. A woman who leaves her phone at home when she steps out for coffee is a woman who understands exactly what her phone has become. She ordered nothing additional. She asked after my health. She told me she hadn't been sleeping well. I told her I understood, and I meant it in more ways than one. We sat together for perhaps 12 minutes. Nothing in our conversation would have given anyone at a neighboring table a single reason to look twice. 2 women in a hard season. Quiet words. A shared silence that could have read as grief. When we stood to leave, she embraced me at the door, the natural, brief embrace of family. And in that moment, she pressed something into my hand. Small, folded, tight. I closed my fingers around it without looking down and held it there until I was in my car with the doors locked and the windows up. 1 paragraph. Her handwriting was small and even, the kind of handwriting that comes from someone accustomed to being careful. She wrote that Markel was the only person who had maintained direct physical access to Everett throughout the entire period. She wrote that she had observed him at 2 recent family dinners and that he was visibly not the same man he had been 3 months prior. Distracted in a way that went beyond tired, careful in a way that looked like guilt. She wrote that her father had given her a specific piece of false financial information, approximately 2 weeks ago, that she had recognized it as false, and that she had been holding it quietly ever since. She did not write what the information was. She wrote that she would find a way to tell me. I sat in that car, and I read the note twice. Then I called Leonard. I read it to him slowly, word for word. When I finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for me to know he was thinking through the same thing I had already started thinking through. Then he said, "Markel is our way in." I agreed. The question was not whether Markel was reachable. A man coming apart the way Nadell was describing is always reachable, given the right approach. The question was how to get to him without a single detail of that approach finding its way back to Sherman Spence. That was a different problem entirely, and it needed to be solved before we took another step. Cormac spent 6 days on Markel. Not Sherman, not the property, just Markel. His grocery stops, his driving routes, the liquor store he walked into twice without buying anything. The laundromat he sat outside for 40 minutes one Thursday, staring through the windshield of his truck while the machines finished inside. What Cormac found was not a hardened criminal. It was a man shrinking. Markel had stopped moving like someone planning for a future. His routines were narrowing instead of expanding. Fewer conversations. Fewer public appearances. He startled badly during one observation when a teenager nearly clipped him with a bicycle outside a pharmacy. Fear changes people's geometry, makes them fold inward around whatever they're carrying. The only stable thing in Markel's week was a Tuesday evening walk. 30 minutes, same neighborhood, no phone visible, no earbuds, no destination beyond movement itself. That was the opening. Leonard approached him on the second Tuesday, just after sunset. No threats, no dramatic confrontation. He exited a bookstore half a block ahead of Markel and simply fell into pace beside him naturally enough that nobody passing would have looked twice. Markel recognized him immediately. Cormac later said the man's shoulders tightened before his face did. A body always reacts first. Leonard gave him several steps before speaking. Then he laid everything out carefully. The property, Gerald Tate, the financial transfers, the surveillance timeline, no exaggeration, no bluffing. Leonard understood something important about frightened men. If they catch even one lie inside your argument, they stop hearing everything else. Markel listened without interrupting once. But when Leonard finally stopped talking, Markel said something neither of them expected. "You should leave this alone. Not aggressive, not defensive, tired." Leonard told me later that was the moment he understood Markel was already breaking internally. Truly loyal people argue. They threaten. They protect the structure they're inside. Defeated people warn you away from it. Leonard told him there was still a path through this if he cooperated before prosecutors arrived at his door first. Then he gave Markel a number, a 20-minute evening window, and 48 hours to decide whether he wanted to be useful or abandoned. Markel did not call. 48 hours passed. Then another day. By the 4th day, Leonard believed the approach had failed completely. Cormac disagreed. He said Markel's behavior after the meeting had changed too sharply for the contact not to matter. The walks stopped entirely. He started checking mirrors while driving. Twice, he left stores abruptly after noticing unfamiliar people nearby. Then came something stranger. Cormac observed Markel pack 2 duffel bags into the back of his truck late one night. The following morning, he drove nearly 2 hours south before pulling into a motel parking lot outside Montgomery. He sat there for almost an hour without getting out. Then he turned around and drove home. Cormac never believed he was trying to flee successfully. He believed Markel was trying to decide whether disappearing was still possible. It wasn't. Then Sherman accelerated everything. Cormac caught it first. The grocery pattern shifted. More supplies purchased at once. Sherman began visiting the property at irregular times instead of fixed intervals. One late-night visit lasted nearly 4 hours longer than normal. And Markel started drinking publicly. That frightened Cormac more than anything else. Careful men who begin unraveling openly usually know pressure is approaching from somewhere they can no longer manage privately. Leonard finally received the call at 11:18 on a Sunday night. Markel sounded drunk at first. He wasn't. He sounded exhausted enough to stop pretending he wasn't terrified. The first thing he said was, "You don't understand how careful he is." Leonard replied quietly, "Then help me understand." There was a long silence after that. Then Markel said Sherman had noticed inconsistencies, not direct surveillance, nothing concrete, just instinct. A feeling that information around him had stopped behaving naturally. Sherman had begun testing people with contradictory details again. Small, false statements designed to expose movement inside his own circle. And someone had failed one of the tests. Not Nadell. Gerald Tate. Sherman had not confronted him directly yet, but Markel believed the timeline had already changed because of it. Everett was being moved, not eventually. Soon. Possibly within the week. That changed the temperature of everything instantly. Leonard asked where Everett was being taken. Markel refused to answer. Not because he wanted to protect Sherman, because he didn't know. And that terrified him too. Then came the part that finally broke whatever remained of his loyalty. Sherman had started discussing containment problems. Plural. Markel believed Sherman was preparing to eliminate weak points before the relocation happened, including him. Leonard asked one final question. "If Holt walks into this tomorrow, are you willing to cooperate formally?" Markel did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded smaller. "He has people watching everything," Leonard replied. "Then this is your last chance to get in front of him." After the call ended, Leonard contacted me immediately. I listened without interrupting while he explained all of it. When he finished, I looked at the clock above my stove and understood something cold and simple. We had crossed the point where private strategy was enough. "Call Holt," I said. Leonard stayed quiet for several seconds. Because once federal law enforcement entered the room, none of this stayed personal anymore. It became permanent. And somewhere inside a locked house outside Birmingham, my son was running out of time faster than any of us realized. Holt agreed to meet within 24 hours. That told me two things immediately. First, Leonard had sent him enough material to survive initial scrutiny. Second, Holt believed there was still time to prevent something worse. Men in federal law enforcement do not move quickly because people sound emotional over the phone. They move quickly when certain patterns begin aligning in ways they've seen before. I was not present for the meeting. That was deliberate. Leonard went alone carrying organized copies of everything gathered so far. Financial transfers, property records, Cormac's surveillance logs, timestamps, photographs, notes. Nothing speculative. Nothing padded for drama. Holt listened for nearly an hour without interrupting. When Leonard finished, Holt asked questions that sounded less like curiosity and more like structural testing. Not, "Do you think Sherman did this?" Questions like, "Who besides Markel can place Sherman physically on that property? Has anyone entered the structure illegally? Can your investigator defend every observation point under oath? What's the weakest part of your timeline right now?" That last question stayed with me after Leonard repeated it later. Because weak parts matter more than strong ones once prosecutors get involved. Holt was careful from the beginning. He made no promises about immunity, no guarantees, no dramatic declarations about rescuing Everett by sunrise. In fact, the first thing he reportedly said after reviewing everything was this: "If your witness folds under pressure, this gets harder fast." Not impossible. Harder. Markel was still a liability whether anyone liked it or not. A frightened cooperating witness with financial exposure is useful, but fragile. Holt understood that immediately. What he offered instead was process. If Markel cooperated formally, Holt could document the cooperation immediately and begin preliminary conversations with federal prosecutors before charges were filed publicly. That mattered because timing changes leverage. A man who comes forward early gets treated differently from a man cornered after arrests begin. But even then, Holt would not move operationally without independent verification. That slowed things down. For 2 full days, Holt's team quietly rechecked pieces of the case themselves. Vehicle registration pulls, financial subpoenas moving through emergency channels, utility usage tied to the property, prior complaints connected to Gerald Tate, old communication metadata between Sherman and entities tied to the dissolved LLC structure. Those 48 hours nearly broke Markel. He called Leonard twice demanding updates, then disappeared for almost an entire day without answering any number Holt's people had for him. Cormac found him eventually sitting in his truck behind a closed bait shop 20 miles outside Birmingham, with a bottle beside him and the engine running. Not fleeing. Thinking about it. Leonard met him there personally. Markel looked terrible by then. Unshaven, eyes bloodshot, talking too fast one moment and not at all the next. "You don't understand what happens if this fails," he said. Leonard answered honestly, "No, but I understand what happens if nobody moves." That was the conversation that finally tipped him. Not promises, not pressure. Truth. Markel agreed to cooperate formally the following morning under recorded federal proffer conditions. Holt insisted on that immediately. No unofficial side conversations anymore. Everything documented from that point forward. And even then, Holt still did not fully trust him. That was the part I respected most. People writing stories imagine federal agents rushing forward the second someone offers information. Real investigators verify first because frightened men sometimes reshape facts without realizing they're doing it. So Holt tested Markel separately, repeatedly. Property layout, door placements, vehicle schedules, which rooms Sherman used personally, where Everett slept, how food entered the structure, what kind of lock secured the upstairs room. Then Holt cross-checked Markel's answers against Cormac's surveillance notes and public records. Most matched. One didn't. Markel originally described the upstairs rear entry incorrectly. That mistake stopped everything cold for nearly 6 hours. Holt believed briefly that Markel might be intentionally feeding partial misinformation to protect himself. Under pressure, Markel finally admitted the truth. Sherman had changed the rear access lock system 3 weeks earlier after suspecting Gerald Tate was becoming careless. That detail, ironically, restored Holt's confidence. Because lies usually simplify situations, truth complicates them. Once Holt believed Markel was finally telling the truth fully, the rest came fast. Everett was alive, weak but mobile, still being held at the property. And Sherman planned to relocate him within 9 days. Then came the detail that shifted the case from urgent to dangerous. Sherman had already started dismantling financial structures tied to Everett's holdings. Slowly, layer by layer, closing dormant entities, moving records, deleting archives selectively instead of all at once. And Holt believed he understood why. A sudden death would trigger scrutiny immediately, board reviews, insurance examinations, succession freezes, emergency audits. But a controlled disappearance wrapped inside a believable personal leave narrative bought Sherman something far more valuable: time. As long as Everett remained technically alive but inaccessible, Sherman could continue restructuring accounts, shifting authorizations, liquidating assets gradually, and cleaning exposed entities before anyone forced open the full financial picture. Every extra day weakened the eventual prosecution, and possibly Everett's chances too. Leonard called me after midnight with the final update. When he finished speaking, I sat quietly at my kitchen table, staring at the dark window above the sink. For months, everything in my life had felt suspended. Fear without direction, grief without proof, instinct without action. That feeling was gone now, replaced by something colder: movement. 9 days. And somewhere inside those 9 days was either my son's way home or the last chance anyone would get to bring him back alive. Holt moved carefully once authorization became formal, not slowly. Carefully. There is a difference. The federal kidnapping statute gave him jurisdictional leverage immediately, but jurisdiction does not magically erase procedure. Warrants still needed signatures. Financial subpoenas still required review. Prosecutors still needed enough confidence in the structure of the case to risk attaching their names to it publicly. And there were still weaknesses. Markell remained the largest one. Holt made that clear from the beginning. "He helps us operationally," Holt reportedly told prosecutors during one meeting. "That doesn't automatically make him believable." That honesty helped more than pretending otherwise would have. Markell received documented acknowledgement of cooperation on the 4th day. Not immunity, not protection from charges, but formal recognition that he had approached federal investigators before arrests occurred and had begun assisting materially. It gave prosecutors room to work with him without promising outcomes they could not legally guarantee yet. He signed the paperwork with shaking hands, according to Leonard. What Holt built afterward was not one perfect case. It was overlap. That mattered because overlap survives attack better than certainty does. Leonard's financial records established movement of money through layered LLC structures tied indirectly back to Sherman. Prosecutors independently verified portions of the transfers across 3 institutions before including them formally. Cormac's surveillance logs established repeated visits to the property, documented timing patterns, grocery purchases, vehicle movement, and audio indicating another male voice inside the structure. The property records connected Gerald Tate to Sherman through old dissolved business entities that initially appeared insignificant until financial analysts rebuilt the relationships chronologically. Then there was Everett's video. That part became unexpectedly complicated. The defense could eventually argue coercion, staging, editing, or incomplete context if chain of custody around the recording became weak. Holt spent nearly an entire day securing authentication procedures around the file itself before formally adding it to evidentiary review. Nothing moved casually anymore. Not after federal prosecutors entered the room. And even then, Holt's team still argued internally over whether they had enough to move operationally. One prosecutor reportedly believed the confinement evidence remained too circumstantial without direct visual confirmation inside the structure. Another worried Sherman might disappear entirely if investigative pressure increased before arrest warrants finalized. For almost 24 hours, the operation stalled. That frightened me more than anything had in weeks. Because stalled systems create time. And time was the one thing Everett no longer had safely. The thing that finally shifted prosecutors fully was not Markell. It was Sherman himself. Digital forensic review recovered evidence that records tied to 2 LLC structures had begun disappearing selectively over recent days. Not mass deletion, curated deletion. Targeted enough to imply consciousness of exposure rather than ordinary business cleanup. That mattered legally. So did the timing. Analysts also began noticing that several of the entities being dissolved or emptied were directly tied to authorizations that still technically depended on Everett remaining alive and publicly unavailable rather than officially deceased. That mattered too. A disappearance creates delay. A death creates scrutiny. And prosecutors finally understood what Holt already suspected. Sherman had not been preserving Everett out of hesitation. He had been preserving the structure around him long enough to finish dismantling it safely. Combined with the relocation timeline Markell described, prosecutors finally saw the same shape Holt already saw. A disciplined subject beginning to dismantle infrastructure before outside intervention arrived. After that, things accelerated, but not recklessly. Every operational decision Holt made revolved around one principle. No move could happen independently. If agents took Sherman first, he might alert Gerald Tate or trigger secondary contingencies before Everett was secured. If they approached the property first and Sherman noticed disrupted communication patterns, Everett could disappear before warrants reached his front door. The arrest and extraction had to become one event. Simultaneous, timed tightly enough that nobody inside Sherman's network could warn anyone else before both ends collapsed together. Holt explained it once during a strategy session Leonard later described to me. "Careful men survive by buying minutes," he said, "so we don't give him any." The operation date was set quietly on the 7th day. Even then, Holt restricted the actual dawn timing to only essential personnel until the final stage. Sherman had spent years building systems around information control. Holt responded by narrowing information until there was almost nothing left to leak. Leonard called me that evening. He did not tell me the date itself, only that there finally was one. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone while he explained that the less I knew operationally, the safer everyone remained if something unexpected happened before the warrants executed. I told him I understood, and I did. After the call ended, I sat alone at my kitchen table, looking around the room where I had spent months learning how to survive uncertainty quietly. But now, uncertainty had changed shape. Before, I feared we would never find Everett. Now, I feared we had found him too late. For the next 6 days, my job became simpler and somehow harder at the same time. Act normal. Answer calls normally. See Nadell without revealing anything. Sleep when possible. Panic nowhere visible. That last part required the most effort. Because once people know the end of a storm is approaching, holding still becomes harder than surviving the storm itself. I cleaned my kitchen at 7 in the evening, even though it did not need cleaning. I wiped down counters that were already clean. I refolded dish towels and aligned them on the rack with a precision that served no purpose. I made tea and set it on the table and forgot about it until it was cold. I did not drink it. I moved to the laundry instead. Folded things that had been sitting in the basket for 2 days, matched socks, smoothed edges. My hands needed to be doing something that required just enough attention to keep them occupied without requiring any part of my mind I needed for other things. The evening passed that way, quietly. Ordinarily, from the outside, it would have looked like nothing at all. I thought about Everett at 7 years old. He had wanted to quit the swim team 3 weeks before the championship. He came to me with a full argument prepared. He was behind the other boys. The practices were too early. He didn't like the smell of the chlorine on his skin. He presented it the way he presented everything even then, organized and reasonable, looking for a yes. I told him no. He was furious in the particular way a 7-year-old gets furious when they have made a reasonable case and been refused anyway. Silent and tight-jawed and wounded. He showed up at the championship. He swam the race he had nearly talked himself out of, and he won it. Not by much. Enough. I thought about his laugh. Too loud. coming from somewhere deep in his chest, the kind of laugh that made other people in rooms turn around not from annoyance, but because something that unguarded is difficult not to look at. I thought about the years he spent building the business before it paid off, the ones he didn't talk about much, the lean, careful years, and what they had cost him in ways that didn't show on a balance sheet. Then I thought about Sherman Spence sitting at my dinner table, passing the breadbasket, asking after my health, looking at me with the composed face of a man who had already done what he had done and was simply waiting for the evening to end so he could go back to managing it. I allowed myself to think about that for exactly as long as it took to understand it fully. Then I set it down. There was one thing left to do before morning. I called Nadell. I had thought carefully about the call. What could be said on a line that might still be carrying something back to her father? How to communicate what needed communicating without handing anyone listening a single useful word. There are ways to speak to someone when you know they will understand the shape of what you mean without requiring the words to be explicit. Nadell and I had arrived through everything that had happened at a place where that kind of communication was possible. I said two things. I will not write what they were. Some things belong only to the moment they were spoken and the two people who shared them. What I will say is that there was a silence after I finished. Not a confused silence, not a frightened one. And then Nadell said, "Okay." That was all. It was enough. I sat in my living room in the dark after that until just before 3 in the morning. Not thinking, not planning. Everything that could be thought and planned had already been thought and planned. I was simply sitting in the last quiet before whatever the morning brought. Then I went to bed. I slept 4 hours, which surprised me when I woke and checked the clock. The body does what it needs to do, even when the mind would keep it awake. I woke before my alarm. The sun was not up yet. I was dressed by 4:30 in the morning, not because I had somewhere to go. Holt had made it clear days earlier that nobody outside the operation would be anywhere near the property once things started moving. I respected that. This was not television. Too many moving pieces depended on discipline. But I could not sit in my house waiting for news in pajamas, like this was an ordinary morning. So I dressed, shoes on, hair done, coat folded over the chair beside me, ready for whatever the phone brought. I sat at my kitchen table with my phone face up beside my hand and watched the clock move through the dark. 5:12, 5:27, 5:41. I did not turn on the television. I did not make coffee. The silence in that kitchen felt too exact for noise. Cormac was already positioned along the service road before first light. Holt had kept him outside the official perimeter, but nobody knew that property better than he did by then. His job that morning was simple. Confirmation. Anything unusual overnight, anything off-pattern, anything suggesting Sherman had moved earlier than expected, and Holt's team needed to know before the first vehicle crossed the tree line. At 5:48, Cormac reported movement. Not Everett. A truck. Old Ford pickup leaving the property earlier than normal with 2 unidentified men inside. For 7 minutes, nobody knew whether the operation had just collapsed. Holt later told Leonard the convoy slowed nearly a mile back while agents verified whether Everett had been moved overnight. If Sherman had relocated him early, they would hit an empty structure while Sherman disappeared into the hours needed to dismantle whatever remained. Then, Cormac caught movement upstairs. Not a perfect visual. Just enough. A faint light shift through the second-floor window, followed by a partial thermal signature moving briefly across the same section of the structure, observed repeatedly during surveillance. Same room, same timing pattern. Everett was still there, The operation resumed. Federal agents moved in from 3 positions using the access points Markel had mapped days earlier. Quiet approach first. No lights, no sirens. Holt wanted Sherman unaware for as long as possible because careful men become dangerous fastest during the first minute after surprise. But Sherman had not survived this long by being careless. One of the exterior cameras hidden near the rear tree line had been repositioned sometime within the previous 48 hours, something Markel had not known. An agent spotted it during final approach seconds before crossing directly into the detection angle. Too late to withdraw cleanly. The breach moved forward immediately. At the same time, agents hit Sherman's house across town before dawn fully broke. Holt later described Sherman opening the door in a robe with the expression of a man whose brain understood the shape of disaster, 1 full second before his body did. No shouting, no dramatic scene, just a careful man realizing the room had shifted around him while he was still standing inside yesterday's assumptions. At the property, the first breach team encountered resistance almost immediately. Not gunfire. A reinforced interior hallway door barricaded from the inside. Not enough to stop federal agents permanently, but enough to delay them nearly 2 minutes. 2 minutes matters in operations like that, especially because nobody knew yet whether someone inside still had physical access to Everett before agents reached him. Holt made the call to force the secondary entry sooner than planned. That decision probably saved time nobody realized they were losing. Everett was exactly where Markel said he would be, but the room was not empty. Gerald Tate was inside with him. Holt never gave me every detail of what happened in those next seconds, and I never asked for them. Some things belong to the people who walked through the door, not the people waiting for news afterward. What I do know is this. Gerald tried to run. He didn't make it far. Everett was awake when agents entered. Holt said he looked like a man who had stopped sleeping deeply months earlier. Thin, unsteady, beard overgrown, but alert immediately the moment the door came open. He stood too quickly and nearly collapsed into the wall beside the cot. The first thing he asked was whether his mother knew he was alive. My phone rang at 6:47. Holt. His voice sounded different now, less controlled. 4 words. He's out. He's safe. I did not answer immediately. I set the phone down carefully beside my hand. Then I placed both palms flat against the kitchen table because suddenly it felt important to be touching something solid. I took 1 breath, then another. The pressure holding my body upright for 4 months released all at once, and my knees understood it before the rest of me did. I sat down slowly. Not because I was weak, because relief strong enough to survive that kind of fear arrives heavy. I still had not seen him, and somewhere underneath the relief, another truth had already begun quietly forming itself. Getting my son out of that room was not the end of this story. It was the beginning of whatever those months had turned him into. Sherman hired a competent lawyer. That mattered more than people think. Bad lawyers lose loudly. Good lawyers slow things down. They find weak joints in timelines, pressure frightened witnesses, challenge procedures, force prosecutors to defend every inch of ground they claim to stand on. A good defense attorney does not need innocence. He needs uncertainty. Sherman's attorney understood that immediately. Leonard called me 2 days after the arrests to explain what was happening. Bail hearings had already become contested. The defense was arguing that Everett had never technically been restrained under conditions meeting federal kidnapping standards. They questioned Markel's credibility before prosecutors even finished building the cooperation structure around him. They pushed aggressively against portions of Cormac's surveillance work, especially anything gathered near the property. "He's trying to fracture the timeline," Leonard said quietly. If he creates enough doubt around when Everett could leave versus when he couldn't, he gives Sherman room. That sentence stayed with me, because careful men rarely build their lives around one defense. Sherman had likely spent years preparing for the possibility that one day he might need ambiguity more than innocence. But what Sherman had not expected was volume, not one piece of evidence, accumulation. The financial transfers alone created problems his attorney could not fully smooth over. 3 separate institutions, layered LLC movement, time-stamped deletion attempts beginning days before the operation. Prosecutors were able to show not only that records disappeared, but exactly when specific deletion sequences accelerated after Sherman realized something inside his structure had shifted. The timing hurt him badly. So did Gerald Tate. That surprised me. Gerald asked for his own attorney within hours of arrest, but by the second day, prosecutors understood something Holt suspected early. Gerald was loyal to Sherman financially, not emotionally. Those kinds of loyalties collapse quickly once prison becomes real enough to touch. By the end of the week, Gerald was cooperating selectively. Not fully, but enough. Enough to confirm Sherman controlled access to the property directly. Enough to establish scheduling patterns around Everett's confinement. Enough to place Sherman physically at the site repeatedly during the months Everett disappeared. That narrowed the defense's room considerably. Markell remained the most fragile part of the case. The defense attacked him exactly the way Holt predicted they would. Criminal exposure, financial motive, delayed cooperation. Every selfish decision he had made got dragged into open air and held there aggressively. And honestly, some of it landed. Not because Markell was lying, because flawed witnesses always leave bruises on a case even when they're telling the truth. Holt prepared for that early. That was why the operation never relied on Markell alone. Every major claim he made had to connect outward into something independently verifiable. Surveillance timing, property layout, lock types, vehicle movement, financial records, phone data, security logs. Prosecutors built the structure so that even if the defense damaged Markell personally, the surrounding evidence still stood upright. That was what Sherman had not expected. Not Lydia, not Leonard, not even Holt. He underestimated process. He believed control worked the same way everywhere because it had always worked inside his own world. Pressure someone, silence someone, delay something, move money quietly enough, and eventually people stop pulling at threads. But federal cases are built slowly for a reason. Once enough independent pieces begin connecting to each other, the structure stops depending on any single person staying quiet. Nadell's situation became its own separate discussion inside the prosecutorial office. The defense initially tried positioning her as knowingly involved in portions of the financial structure. That frightened her badly enough that Everett called me from the recovery facility one evening just to ask whether she'd been formally charged. She hadn't. But prosecutors did not simply clear her immediately either. She retained counsel temporarily, submitted to formal interviews. Financial analysts reviewed years of signatures and transaction patterns tied to her name. Investigators compared timelines against communication records, device activity, and the spyware Holt's digital team eventually confirmed had been installed on her phone. And slowly, the shape around her changed. The evidence kept bending prosecutors toward coercion instead of participation. The spyware mattered. The years-old signatures mattered. The false information Sherman intentionally fed her mattered even more. Because it established behavioral control patterns, prosecutors could explain clearly to a jury, not innocence, context. That distinction mattered legally. I stayed away from the hearings, not strategically, personally. I had spent months learning how to function while carrying fear quietly inside my body. Once Everett came home, I discovered something stranger. Relief carries its own exhaustion. Everett was eating again by then, but slowly, sleeping harder some nights and barely at all others. Certain sudden noises still pulled him upright too quickly. Once, he dropped a glass at my kitchen sink because somebody slammed a car door outside. He stared at the broken pieces longer than the sound itself deserved. Leonard called after one hearing and told me Sherman looked at the prosecution table most of the morning and barely toward the gallery at all. "He's still trying to calculate his way out," Leonard said. Maybe he was, but calculations stop working eventually when enough other people finally compare notes. After I ended the call, I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time thinking about Everett. Not the rescue, the aftermath. What happens after survival? Some injuries leave scars. Others rearrange a person more quietly than that. And sitting there in the silence of my house, I realized none of us yet knew which kind my son had come home carrying. 6 weeks after the rescue, Everett was at my house more than his own. He did not announce this as a decision. He simply started showing up, sometimes with a bag, sometimes without one, sometimes staying 3 days before returning to his house for a night and coming back the following afternoon. I did not comment on the pattern. I made space for it the way you make space for something that needs room without being named. He ate slowly at first, not without appetite. That had returned, which was one of the first things I watched for. But with the particular deliberateness of a man relearning ordinary things. Some mornings he slept until nearly noon. Other nights he woke too quickly at small sounds and paced my kitchen drinking water in the dark before settling again. Recovery did not move in a straight line. Neither did conversation. There were days Everett sat on my back porch for an hour without saying anything, and days he talked through lunch and into the afternoon about everything except the months he had lost. I did not push. I have spent a lifetime knowing the difference between a silence that needs breaking and one that simply needs company. Everett and Nadell remained in contact. That much I knew. Whether that contact would become something stronger or remain what it currently was, two people carefully navigating the wreckage of a shared life, was not a question I could answer, and not one he asked me to weigh in on. I have my own feelings about Nadell. I hold them quietly. What I will say is this. That woman left her phone at home and walked into a coffee shop and pressed a folded note into my hand when she could have stayed silent behind locked doors, waiting for consequences to choose her instead. That note helped bring my son home. I do not forget things like that. I am not built to forget them. What Everett eventually decides about his marriage belongs entirely to Everett. On a Thursday evening, 6 weeks and 2 days after Holt called me with 4 words, I watched my son eat a full meal at my kitchen table. Not carefully this time. Not slowly. With appetite. With presence. He reached for a second plate without thinking about it and started telling me a story about one of his colleagues mispronouncing a client's name during a recovery meeting. Then he laughed before finishing the story. The laugh came from the same place it always had. Too loud. From somewhere deep in his chest. The kind of laugh that fills a room without asking permission. I stood there listening to it and felt something I did not immediately have language for. Not simple relief. Relief is cleaner than that. This felt layered, built from months of fear, patience, restraint, and work nobody outside the room would ever fully understand. I thought about everything that had happened between the afternoon Leonard played that video and the morning Holt called me at 6:47. I had done all of it quietly, without collapsing publicly, without announcing fear, without letting a single person who underestimated me understand what I was building behind the stillness they mistook for helplessness. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes from surviving something like that. Not pride, exactly. Something steadier. Once you understand what you are capable of carrying, the knowledge settles permanently into the structure of who you are. I cleared Everett's plate after dinner and stood at my kitchen sink looking out at the yard. Late evening light resting softly across the grass, the ordinary quiet of a Thursday in Birmingham finally feeling ordinary again. And for the first time in months, my body was no longer waiting for the phone to ring. I thought about Sherman Spence sitting in a federal detention facility less than an hour away. I thought about the way he used to study people across dinner tables, calm, assessing, already convinced he understood exactly who they were and how much danger they could possibly represent to him. I thought about what he decided I was: a quiet, older woman, a mother, someone emotional enough to underestimate and soft enough to outmaneuver. I almost smiled standing there at the sink, because some people spend their whole lives mistaking a quiet woman for a harmless one.